How much failure, certainly in our minds, haven't we been through? How much haven't we battled trying to come to terms with the fact that we haven't ever managed to accumulate material wealth? How insignificant haven't we felt when we compare ourselves with the so-called super saints? And so we could go on and on forever and ever. Our lives have in many senses been permeated by pain. And I've got a picture of Jesus holding my face, and as I remember all that pain, I just sob and sob. And every time I sob, he brushes away the tears of that episode so that we experience a complete catharsis. Each sob sees us delivered from the wound, that particular wound, until there is nothing left of the anguish we have been through. We become totally liberated by his presence and understanding, and he comforts us until there is no pain left. Then there is another consolation spoken about here, and it's found in the second half of verse 4. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. We're told in 1 Corinthians 15:26 that Jesus must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. And how true that is. The fact is that until this moment in time, death will be our common and dreadful enemy. Death is something which, unless the Lord returns, every single one of us will have to face and pass through. Jesus had to face and suffer death himself, but he did so as the only human being ever born who didn't have to endure it. And that because the wages of sin is death, and Jesus did not sin. Rather, he died to rescue us from both spiritual sin, which guarantees physical death, and the physical death itself. The only people who won't have to die physically are those who will still be alive on this earth and who are his children at the return of Jesus to collect his people. But even if we are blessed to be amongst those who escape physical death because of Jesus' return, our lives are lived under the shadow of death. As Isaiah 25:7 puts it, on this mountain he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all people, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. What consolation! Our lives are beset with death and our fear of it. Even if we don't die, we cry and we mourn and we are in pain because of the people whom we love who do die. Just think about this COVID pandemic, which has been going on for nearly 2 years now, and how the majority of South Africans have been living in fear and dread. And how much haven't we prayed for family and friends not to contract the virus? And how much time haven't we lived beset with the fear of dying or mourning the death of people we love? I think that the people who have had the hardest time at this time are our healthcare workers. There they are doing their level best, which they know is not necessarily good enough, as they try desperately to keep people alive. And it's no wonder then that the Lord calls this situation the shroud that enfolds all people. What bliss and consolation then that the time is coming when there will be no more death. So there will be no more mourning or crying or pain, because the old order of things has passed away. And the Greek there means to be rendered void or disregarded. At the return of Jesus, we will be liberated from our fear of death, or even death itself. We are already, as his children, not going to die spiritually. But a time is coming when Jesus, by his presence, will void our fear of death and death itself. At that point, even our memory of death will be erased. We won't be able to remember it, and we won't ever experience it. Thirdly, and following God's consolation, the fact is that God's life will be released. God's life will be released. And we have to go to Revelation 22 to see this in action. And what is important for us to grasp from this passage of Scripture is the fact that it describes the complete liberation from the events of the fall of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And so we read in chapter 22, verses 1 and 2, "Then the angel showed me the river of water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of the street of the city, and on each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations." Again, we are well aware that in Genesis 2:10, we are told that a river watering the Garden of Eden flowed from Eden, and from there it divided. It had 4 head streams. Just before we are told about the river, which surely is a description of that which we cannot survive without, that is water, we learn that in the middle of the garden there was the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God told Adam and Eve that you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat of it, you will surely die. Have you ever wondered why they didn't eat from the tree of life, given that it speaks of the possibility of them growing exponentially and perpetually in their relationship with God? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, however, was forbidden them because to know something in the Hebrew worldview means to actually experience something firsthand. And so God in his love forbade them to eat from that tree because he knew that they would experience evil firsthand and hence die in their disobedience. In Revelation 22, and as I read it, there is not a single tree of life in that garden, but 12 of them, indicating that there is no end to the understanding God wishes us to come to concerning himself and his new creation. Moreover, the fruit was there for the healing of the nations. And I think this is a reference to the fact that Jesus is going to save people from every tribe and tongue, and all would need to grow to know God ever more intimately and to be healed of the wounds of life on this fallen and sickly planet. Notice something, that there is no tree of the knowledge of good and evil, meaning that there will be nothing to serve as a temptation for us ever again. Next, we are told that there will be no curse. And verse 3 speaks of that. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him. In Genesis, following their rebellion, Adam and Eve were cursed, as was Satan. Eve was cursed with pain during childbirth, whilst Adam was cursed with having to farm in land which would now be contaminated with the hindrances of thorns and thistles. Now, in the new heaven and the new earth, there is going to be no curse. Why not? Because by this time, the only people on earth would be sinless in the eyes of God. As Galatians 3:13 puts it, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. The curse upon Christ totally negated the need for anyone else to be cursed, providing they listen to his call and yield to his lordship, and thus gain his forgiveness. Finally, and perhaps the most glorious part of God releasing his life is found in verse 4, where it says, "And they will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads." We remember Moses on top of Sinai asking God, "Now show me your glory." And the Lord said, "I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence." God was going to reveal his very nature to Moses. But then he says, "You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." So glorious is the holiness of God, and so dazzling is the physical manifestation of that holiness, that we as human beings, even saved human beings, cannot tolerate it. It would destroy us. Thus, when we are told that we will see the face of Jesus, it means that once again, in his infinite love and mercy, God will grant us to see Jesus' face, because that is all, as it were, that we will be able to tolerate. More than that, to see Jesus' face means to know him in ever-increasing measure. 1 Corinthians 13:12 says, "Now we see but a poor reflection, then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known." By this time in salvation history, we, his children, will be totally his possession. Hence his name on our foreheads. Even more magnificently, we will see Jesus' face, so that we will learn eternally who he really is. Not one single Christian knows Jesus as we yearn to and as we want to. But the time is coming when we will proceed into eternity face to face with him, knowing him ever more thoroughly. For the Hebrews, to see somebody's face meant to know them. And our greatest liberation will be knowing Jesus with ever increasing understanding. Being a believer in these days is difficult and dangerous. It is also a daily battle to relinquish our wills to his will. But if we take seriously what he will be for and do for us at the end of human history, surely we will begin to realize that ultimately all this life has to offer is ever-increasing pain and confusion, and what we have to look forward to will absolutely obliterate that.